Welcome everyone to the Waterwatch Workshop, which is proudly funded by the cities of Darebin, Moreland and Yarra and hosted by Mary Creek Management Committee. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I'm meeting you today, which is the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, as well as to elders emerging, and also elders from other communities who may be with us here today. As I mentioned before, my name is Julia Cirillo and I'm the Waterwatch Coordinator at Mary Creek Management Committee. My role is to work with schools and the local community to raise an awareness of the importance of looking after our local creeks and wetlands. We work with many stakeholders, including local government, to get the best outcomes for our creeks. Thank you so much for joining us today, everybody. And I'd like to introduce Trevor Holzer, Friends of Mary Creek Stream Team Waterwatch Leader and Waterwatch Education Officer at Mary Creek Management Committee. Trevor's going to go through the agenda now, which I will flash up so you can see what we're doing today. Thanks, Trevor.
All right, so we're just going to have Julie's going to give you an introduction to Waterwatch and what the program's about. And then we'll go on and look at some of the physical and chemical parameters that we look at in Waterwatch and explain the importance of them and what effects they have on the creek. And then Julie will also tell you a little bit about how to join Waterwatch groups and what the process is. And then we'll have a bit of a break because after that you'll probably get sick of listening to us. And then after the break we'll go on and get on to the really interesting stuff, which is the macroinvertebrates. Just might as well get started and you can start telling us about Waterwatch.
So Waterwatch in Melbourne, we cover Greater Melbourne is an area of over 12,000 square kilometres, which includes, probably closer to 4 million people now, and 8,400 kilometres of waterways, all of which flow into Port Phillip or Western Port Bay. So all the water in the Greater Melbourne region will end up into the Port Phillip or either the Western Port Bay. So Waterwatch, for those that are not familiar with us, we've been around in Victoria for over 25 years now, getting close to 30 actually, and we're basically a citizen science project is probably the easiest way to describe us. And so we do a lot of monitoring of water quality with the community. So this includes water quality testing, macroinvertebrate sampling with water bugs, habitat surveys, litter surveys. I have a really large program at Mary Creek Management Committee around community litter surveys, which we also collect citizen science data. So happy to talk more about that if people have questions about that today and how you can be involved. Refuge monitoring during drought conditions, drain spotters, which is the stormwater drains, photo point monitoring, frog census. So we do a lot using the Melbourne Water Frog Census app and collecting data on frogs, and we do run quite a number of community events on that. Bird surveys, platypus surveys, and you know what, I've just realised I've written litter surveys there twice. I think I should get rid of that. I'm obviously loving litter. I also work a lot with from preschool up to tertiary education, and we run a lot of community events as well, river health information centres, sessions, community festivals, school holiday programs. One of the big things, I guess, and we're really happy that you guys are here today, is that we really want what we really want to do with the water quality data. It's great for education, but we actually also want to collect really accurate and rigorous data. And to do that in a citizen science format, we follow the same methodologies and use the same equipment and make sure that we calibrate it. Any data that we get that's at a good standard, we have a level of quality assurance, quality control, goes onto our Waterwatch database or Waterwatch portal. And I will be sending you all a link to that after today. So we call this the water quality information we collect and the water bug data information we collect data. And this is entered into the Waterwatch database. It's included in annual reports to local government and community. It's posted onto our website as annual summaries, and it's featured in Waterwatch and stakeholder so for example, EPA newsletters, so the EPA do use it from time to time, supplied to other stakeholders or anyone on request, used by Melbourne Water to protect and enhance waterway health. And of course, it's available to anyone to access online. And I might just show you, I might just sort of stop that for a second, and I just want to show you guys where you can find we've been working quite hard, the Merri Creek Management Committee, all the Waterwatch monitors over the last couple of years, putting together water quality data. So I'm just going to show you that. I'm going to share the website so you can see that, and I will be sending the link to you all with that one as well. So this is the website here, Merri Creek Management Committee, and I've gone to under environmental education, Waterwatch water quality summaries. So we actually have a map here of the main area that Merri Creek Management Committee Waterwatch volunteers do their monthly sampling, and you can just click on any of them. And for this one's got a water bug report. Down here we've got a regular group, the Northcote Golf Club, and you can just click on the 2019 report, and then you can actually see what they've been working on there. So they've actually compiled their data over 12 months. They'll have a map of where they are. They'll have a few graphs showing the parameters and what they're displaying, what they're actually monitoring, a bit of an introduction of the site, and a summary of what the data is telling them. So we've been working really hard at summarising them. So you can use the Waterwatch database to see the raw data, so the information that's been collected and entered each month. But the summaries are a really good way if you just want to get a bit of a picture over the last year, how things have been going at particular spots. This is something that comes up in every training that we have. You really can't just go out once to a creek, do some testing, observe, and then make a conclusion. Oh, the water, this creek is highly polluted. You really need to know your creek and the section really well, and that's why we encourage frequency, that you go out at least monthly to collect information, because things change over time. Depending on the rainfall, depending on the weather conditions, climate change, or what's going on in the catchment itself, the land uses. It's constantly changing. So one day, your water quality results might be informing you that, gee, things aren't looking very good here. The ecological health doesn't look good. But then on another day, it might be quite different. So when you're collecting your water sample at the creek, obviously in the fieldwork component we'll do this for real, but some of the things we try to remember to do to keep to the methodology, to make sure that we're all doing it in the same way, is we collect from the same sampling location each time. Try and collect at the same time of day. So most of the Waterwatch groups will go out, it might be a Sunday morning once a month or the afternoon. They try and keep to the same time no matter what the season. You need to rinse all your sampling gear 3 times. So everything in Waterwatch is 3 times, obviously to reduce the chances of cross-contamination. Handle, test and analyse in the same way each time, and ensure your sample container and methods are appropriate. We've got more information, and this is also on that agenda that I emailed you all, the links to videos on collecting water samples. I know most of you are probably really keen to get out there and do the water sampling, and unfortunately because we're online today we can't do that, but there's some great, Melbourne Water has some great links to instructions, and the West Gippsland Catchment Management Authority also has some really good YouTube clips on how to collect water sample and how to do the different testing, and they use very similar equipment to what we do. So if you can't wait to get out in the field and you want to just sort of see what's some of the equipment that we use and what methods we use, have a bit of a look at that. We also try to sample midstream, 20 centimetres below the surface, and I emphasise the words try, because obviously if it's a really shallow creek, if there's not a lot of flow at the time, you try and do the best you can. In the main current and upstream, so upstream if you're going to be collecting bugs or anything else that you might be doing, and at the same spot every time you sample, so consistency where possible.
It's just Julius, one question here from Cassandra about showing you again where the Merri Creek website is. Maybe we'll just send that link to that.
Oh yes, the summaries. Yeah, I can put that in the chat. We're at break time, because I'm just realising when I'm sharing my screen I can't see chat, unfortunately. But I'll the Waterwatch summaries.
Yeah,
I'll put that in chat at break. Thank you. So where I'm going to go to from here is to start talking about the actual water testing equipment that we use and the parameters that we test. And as Trevor mentioned, after the break we're going to talk about the other citizen science method we use, which is water bug sampling. So that's more the biological sampling. So we're going to start with the physical chemical testing. Now, hopefully some of you were able to get the training manual that I sent in my email. So this is a really good resource to have open up if you can, if you're on a desktop. I know it's a bit difficult if you're on a smaller device, but this is a good resource to have while Trevor and I are going through the water quality parameters and the water bugs later after the break, and also afterwards, before having a good look at this before we meet for the field work component, so that you're a bit more familiar. It sort of covers everything. We use this all day on the Waterwatch training when we have the whole day thing, but I'd suggest I'm starting to talk about the parameters. So we're going to start with temperature, which starts on page 9. So I'd suggest you go to page 9, or I might even say page 7 actually. It looks like the page says page 9 at the bottom, but I think it's page 7.
Page 9.
It is page 9, good. I think there's about 3 pages on temperature, and the last page of all the parameters usually has the equipment that we use. So, and in this case, you can see the digital thermometer. I think we all use that around the Melbourne areas. So it's also got quite a bit of information on the equipment that we use and instructions. So then when we actually get to do the fieldwork component and we have all the equipment, you can actually use the instructions to actually use the equipment. Obviously, Trevor and I will be there to help as well, but later on when you go out into the field and do water testing and we're not there, this should help you as well. So temperature is a great one to start with because it can obviously change quite a lot as well. And temperature affects the physical, chemical and biological characteristics. So it changes. We mentioned one thing about when you're sampling, it's good to go out at the same time every day, particularly say in the summer season, going out earlier in the morning or whenever you go, just trying to make it the same time for consistency. And temperature is obviously affected by the depth of the water, the season and the time of day. So temperature itself on its own doesn't tell us a whole lot, but it's more about how it's connected to the other parameters that we're going to be talking about today. Some of the things, though, that are quite interesting to capture when you're looking at temperature is the changes of so we take an air temperature, which is just holding the digital thermometer in the air and counting to 30, just so you get an idea of the weather really, and we also then put it in the water sample itself. And depending on where you are in your catchment or on a creek, if you're in an urban area versus a regional area, it can be really different. So, for example, the urban runoff, you'll find urban creeks are usually a lot warmer. So obviously a lot of the water from creeks comes from our catchments. So it's coming from roads, it's coming from car parks, it's coming from, it could be industrial areas, a lot of paved areas. So when it rains and that water falls on those paved areas, it then will flow into the stormwater drains that are lining the street. And if it's a really busy road, the traffic with the tyres causes a lot of friction, and that actually warms up the road. So you might have noticed that, particularly those that bike ride like myself, after you can sort of feel the heat in certain areas. If there's a lot of traffic, you can just feel the heat on the surface. And also particularly if you've had a really hot day and then it rains, you can just feel that heat. So all that heat will then also go into the water and goes up into the creek as well. So urban changes, you're going to have warmer temperatures. Say as averse to say a regional area that it might be coming off a mountain stream, or it might be an area that's fully vegetated, and the water's percolating slowly through the treetops, through the leaves, through the plants, and then going through the soil really slowly. That's going to obviously have a lower temperature, and it'll be cleaner as well, that water, because it would have been filtered through the soil. But when it's coming straight off concrete, not only is it going to be warmer, it's going to have a higher velocity. The water's going to come through really quickly and cause things like erosion. And it's also going to be a lot less clean, because it's not just bringing the water from those stormwater drains, it's bringing out whatever else might be on that road as well. Bits of rubber, litter, dirt, all sorts of things, dust, chemicals if there's been a spill. Industrial discharges are another thing that could increase the water temperature if there's a factory that's either legally or illegally putting discharge into a stormwater drain that's coming into a creek if it's been used for certain processes. Clearing of verge vegetation. So verge just means in habitat terms the riparian zone, the zone from the bank where the water is up about 30 metres. So that's all part of the creek system. Sometimes that seems to get forgotten in development when they start when there's inappropriate development. When we say inappropriate development, we're calling that where housing or other infrastructure is built in the verge or riparian zone, which is from the water's edge, 30 to 50 metres back. So if you're clearing vegetation in those areas, obviously there's no canopy, there's no overhanging trees overhanging your river or creek, so the water temperature will also heat up there. On the other side, discharges from reservoirs, usually they discharge water from the bottom of the reservoir, which is a lot colder, so it can really rapidly decrease a water temperature. And turbidity as well. So turbidity is, I think Trevor's going to be talking about that one, aren't you, Trevor?
How dirty the water is.
Yes, how dirty the water it is. So he'll be talking more about that, but that can actually also increase the temperature as well. Yes, so that's probably the main things there I was going to talk about. Oh, so did you want me to talk about this, Trevor, or did you want to go? Sorry, I think I jumped in, didn't I?
I'll do turbidity and DO next.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, can you see that I'm on turbidity?
I can see that.
Yep.
All right, now turbidity, as we say, is basically how dirty the water is. And earlier on, someone was asking about the conditions of creeks at the moment. And the photo that you can see there is actually of the Merri Creek where it joins onto the Yarra River. And the pale milky browny colour is the Merri Creek and the darker water is the Yarra River. And we took this photo, about 4 or 5 years ago? 5, 6 years ago?
Probably not even that long. I think it was about 3 years ago.
Yeah, 3 years ago. What had happened is we'd had a whole lot of rain around Melbourne, particularly in the northern part of Melbourne, and suddenly the Merri Creek changed colour. And it went to this very distinctive milky brown, almost latte type colour. We followed it up and what we found is that all the sediment that's coming down there is coming down from up in Calcallo Creek, which is about 40 kilometres north of Melbourne. And there's a whole lot of gully erosion in Calcallo Creek as well as housing development going on there. And the particular type of soil is very prone to erosion and creating very fine sediment. And that sediment's not getting caught up by the sedimentation ponds at the development sites and is going straight into the Merri Creek and isn't settling out and is coming all the way down Merri Creek and going into the Yarra. So that's a really interesting example of turbidity and is relevant at the moment because the rain we had last week, the heavy storms, have caused exactly the same problem. I live on the Merri Creek and I can look out my window at the moment and see the same colour in the Merri Creek. And it's been like that for the last week and it will probably stay that way for another week or two before it finally all flows out. So turbidity is a major problem in urban areas, particularly if the area around the edges of the creek has been cleared and water can flow over the top of the ground and wash sediment into the creeks. It causes, as you can imagine, it causes a lot of trouble. If the water's too turbid, the light can't penetrate, so plants can't grow properly. It also smothers the habitat. There's a lot of small insects and that live in the creeks and all this sediment coming in. They're living on the plants and living on the rocks in the creek, and basically their habitat gets smothered by layers of mud, which doesn't do them any good. It also can bring in a lot of excess nutrients into the creek. So naturally, nutrients in waterways come from the soils and the rock formations around them. When you get a lot of the soil getting washed in the creek, that's adding extra nutrients. So these are all problems, and they're particularly major problems in urban areas. And it's one of the things when you're doing Waterwatch, you notice changes a lot. A lot of the other parameters don't change enormously. the turbidity changes a lot. And you'll notice after heavy rain, a lot of our creeks not only get plastic and rubbish in them, they also become very turbid. And you'll notice that the water's the cleanest after long dry periods. So we find in late autumn, say March, early April, when it hasn't rained for a while, actually the quality of the water is much improved. So that's turbidity, and we'll go on to, do you want to add anything?
Oh yeah, just before you move on, you've just a great description there. I really enjoyed listening to that. Hope others did too. But it reminded me that regarding the Merri Creek, we've actually, our manager at Merri Creek Management Committee has written some really interesting reports on this issue with the muddy Merri water and what's been happening upstream and why it is the way it is. So I'll actually put those articles, the links to the articles in chat during the break time for those that are interested in learning more about that as well, because it's been a really interesting phenomena for us to study.
I'll probably, just the other thing before we finish on turbidity is the little diagram on the side showing you a turbidity tube, and that's how we measure turbidity. And basically it's just a long tube with a little disc at the bottom with white disc with 3 wavy black lines, and you pour water into the tube and look down until those lines disappear. So obviously if the water's very dirty, you only have to put a little bit and they disappear. If the water's very clean, you can fill it all the way up to the top. And still see the wavy black lines. So it's a simple way of measuring turbidity, and there's a scale on the side of the tube to give you your actual measure.
Yeah, it's a really simple one, Trevor, isn't it? But it's really effective. Like I've done this with kindergarten kids, and they sort of get the idea of it. So it's a really great, I guess, test to do for all ages, because it's so tangible. You can just see the colour changing. So it's a really good one to do, and very inexpensive. Oh, well, I think the tubes are now probably about $50, but they last for years. I think we've got some that are 20 or 30 years old at Merri Creek that we're still using. So it's a good investment. Yeah. I'll move on.
The only other thing with that one is it is very subjective, because as you get older, your eyesight deteriorates. So you can't always see the 3 wavy black lines as clear as you could when you were 15 or 16. But it's still a good measure. Now, next one's dissolved oxygen. That's obviously a very important factor in any waterway. I mean, all the animals that live in the waterways have to breathe, and so they need dissolved oxygen. But dissolved oxygen is affected by a number of things, particularly temperature. As water heats up, it will actually hold less oxygen in it. And so that's why you notice, maybe if you're walking along a waterway on a particularly hot summer's day, that some of the fish are coming up to the surface and gulping water from the surface. That's because the actual water concentration, well, the oxygen concentration in the water is starting to decrease. So in Waterwatch, we actually go and measure. The test we do is a colorimetric test. You get a sample of water, you add some chemicals, and it creates a red colour, and the deeper the red colour tells you how much oxygen's in the water. So that's actually giving you milligrams per litre of oxygen. But actually, because the amount of oxygen held in the water is affected by the temperature, what we want to really know is what we call the percentage saturation. So that's the percentage of the maximum amount of oxygen that will be held in the water at that particular temperature. And we do that. You can see the little diagram up in the top right-hand corner. That's a scale. The top line of the scale is temperature, and the bottom line is it's one way or the other.
Yeah, no, you're right. Water temperature's up the top. You're right.
Yeah, water temperature up the top. The bottom line is your milligrams per litre of oxygen. And then the sloping line in the middle, you run a ruler or line directly between your temperature and your milligrams of oxygen. And where it crosses the sloping line, that gives you your percentage saturation. And that's the really important measure. So we want to know as a percentage of how much the maximum amount of oxygen you can get in the water we've got. And we want it to be above 80% for most animals. And it will vary. Sometimes it will be high, sometimes it'll be quite low. How does oxygen get into the water is another factor. Oh, it's another thing. If any of you have got a fish tank and you put the little bubbler in your fish tank, that's putting oxygen in the water of your fish tank, because oxygen can only get in by the surface, and the bubbles create extra surface area. In a stream, again, the oxygen can only get in through the surface, but if water's running over a whole lot of rocks, which we call riffle areas, that creates a whole lot of extra surface area and turbulence, and they're really important for getting oxygen into the water. And so it's important in natural streams that you have these series of rocky riffle areas to help oxygenate the water. Because if it is all just very calm and still, and particularly if it's deep, you can get sections where the oxygen levels drop. And like in lakes, you can actually have layers in lakes. If it's a very deep lake, you'll have a surface layer where there's a lot of oxygen in the water, but the bottom layers of the lake can become totally anoxic because there's no mixing going on. So oxygen is important. It's affected by a number of things. And obviously, if the water temperatures artificially increase by being in urban areas, that's going to decrease the amount of oxygen that will go in the water, or the water will hold. So, and it's also things like shading of the creek. If you clear all the vegetation away, again, the temperature of the water can go up, and therefore the oxygen level will go down. The other main source of oxygen in water is plants. Obviously, when plants carry out photosynthesis, they produce oxygen. So plants that are in the water, when they're photosynthesizing, they're contributing oxygen to the water. Now, the only thing with the plants is if you get a lot of plants in the water, at night, plants don't carry out photosynthesis, but they still carry out respiration. So they'll actually be taking oxygen out of the water when they're respiring. So if you've got too much plant growth in the water, you can get these situations where during the late afternoon, there's a lot of oxygen in the water, but then in the middle of the night, the oxygen levels can drop a lot, and that can cause problems. So, that's probably, unless you want to add anything.
No, the only thing I'll mention is that if you want to know more about dissolved oxygen, because it is a really interesting parameter to measure, we do actually, I'll be sending this in an email afterwards. There's a great Waterwatch guide interpreting water quality health, and it's basically got a really good I guess, description of some of the things that Trevor's talked about and what to be careful of when you're actually collecting the data and monitoring it. So that's a really good resource if you want to know more about dissolved oxygen. And the other thing I was going to, oh, it's gone out of my head now. Oh, yes, that's what I was going to mention. The other thing is when groups are monitoring the dissolved oxygen, that's one of the things that Trevor talked about is the different levels of oxygen, particularly in areas that the water's deep or in areas where where it might be pooling. So that's why it's really important as a water watch group that you monitor in the same spot every time, because then you can actually see, has there been a change to the dissolved oxygen, and what might that reason be? It might be, well, there hasn't been rain for a while, so there's only some pools and there's no water moving through, or wow, we've had some excessive growth of aquatic plants and they've taken over the whole bed layer, so that's probably why the dissolved oxygen's gone down. So that's why it's really important to try and pick around the same spot each time to actually do the monitoring so you can compare it.
And also, the other thing is particularly important when you're collecting your water sample for measuring oxygen, that you actually collect it from 20 centimetres below the surface of the water.
Which sounds easy, but can be a bit tricky, can't it?
But that's a particularly important one, that you collect it from below. Something like turbidity, the surface water is not going to be much different from 20 centimetres down. But for oxygen level, it's particularly important to get it at that same depth each time.
And we'll go through how to sort of do that at the fieldwork component as well. It is a good one to do when we do the fieldwork, to make sure you do make some time to do that, because it is a little bit more of a trickier one, and there's a lot of the method that we use, which is in the manual, that we use like a modified Winkler titration method, where you form a precipitate and you've got to drop in some indicator. There's so many steps, so yeah, if you miss a step, you've got to start again. So it's a really good one to have a bit of a practice, like getting the sample itself as well as actually doing the steps. Thanks, Trevor.
pH?
Yeah, did you want me to do that, or
You can do that.
Yep, I'll give you a little break. You can check the chat if there's any chat. So pH, another really interesting one to do. You can see here in the image, we've got the actual scale for pH, which some of you might remember at school. It's one we focus a lot in the chemistry class and science class. The scale goes from 0 to 14. Obviously, 7 is neutral. And you sort of want a good ecological healthy stream should be something around between 6.8 probably to around 8.2, sort of that range. And you'll find, again, when you go out monthly, that most creeks should keep to around the same pH. So some are going to be slightly more acidic and others are going to be slightly more alkaline. So it is very good to know your creek, to know, well, what is the normal range for this creek? And obviously that's going to depend on lots of factors. So a natural pH factor can vary depending on the geology and soils of the catchment. So the geology, whether it's more has a volcanic basalt background, or is it more sedimentary Silurian, like older soils, that can actually change the pH. So it might be a little bit more alkaline or a little bit more acidic. Of course, other things, such as human activities, particularly in urban environments, actually do change the pH a lot. And that's one reason that we use the pH range in an urban context, because it can change so much. So what I really like about this image is you can see down the bottom, it gives you some examples of some of the things that may cause that pH to change. So if you're monitoring down at a site on the Merry Creek that's normally around 7.8, just over 8, and you're suddenly getting up to 11, you know, obviously something's going wrong there, and it could be excess nutrients. Ammonia can also, and we're going to talk more about ammonia a bit later, but it could be from a spilled sewage system or something like that. So it just gives you a really good idea straight away. Well, how are things going here? What's been added to the system that, you know, you might not be able to know exactly what it is, what's been added to the system, but you know that something's changed, something's wrong. So human activities such as stormwater, obviously I talked a bit more before about rainwater coming in from a lot of paved areas, and what else it might be bringing in, whether it's bringing in litter from an area, there might be some spillages, particularly on roads. You know, you've got petrol and oil and other things like that might be on the roads that's then coming into your creek system from the stormwater drains. Could be another one that happens quite a lot is people washing their cars. So people washing their cars on their driveway, obviously most of our driveways are cantilevered to slope to actually remove that water. So that soapy water then will end up in a stormwater drain and in your local creek. So that detergent can also change the pH as well, and it'll be noticeable. You'll see that those bubbles on the surface of the water. And detergent not only is bad for the pH, it changes the pH, it adds a toxic substance to the creek, but it also, for animals like ducks that have a natural oil on their feathers, detergent is there to cut grease and oil. So those ducks, when they dive down into soapy water, the detergent can actually take away some of those natural oils. So then they have difficulty coming out of the water, brushing the water off after they've dived in, and then they're coming back up, and they usually have to shake themselves out so they don't get too cold afterwards. And if they've got less of that natural oil, they're not able to do that. So it can have a lot of those on-flow effects. And agricultural runoff as well. So there's a number of Waterwatch groups monitoring sites that have farmland and different cropping and things like that. That can actually have an impact on the pH as well. Now we do monitor this one in the manual. You'll see there's lots of different pH meters, and they basically, a lot of them have like a glass bulb or a sensor that has hydrogen ions. It actually changes the hydrogen ions. That's how it works out the pH. So we have lots of different ways of measuring it. So when we do the fieldwork component, you'll get to use the different equipment that we use. And the really important thing with pH is you need to calibrate the meter. So we want to make sure that it works accurately. We use a digital pH meter for these that measure to 1 decimal point. There's a lot of pH meters that go to 2 decimal points. We measure to 1 decimal point. And we need to calibrate it. We have 3 different buffers. We have a more acidic side, the 4 buffer. We have the neutral, around 7, and then we have an alkaline, which I think we usually use 10, don't we? Yes. So, yeah, 10. So it's really important to actually calibrate your meter before each day that you use it to go out water testing. Is there anything you wanted to add, Trevor, to pH?
No, that's fine.
Yep. Okay. Moving on to salinity or electrical conductivity. So this is, again, a really good one to do, and even with younger children, I find it's a really good one to do because it's such an important parameter, and I guess the concepts are quite easy for most of us to sort of grasp. Obviously, the Merri Creek, like other tributaries of the Yarra River, are freshwater streams. So they require low amounts of salinity. We don't want high amounts of salinity. Obviously, they flow into, the Merri Creek flows into the Yarra, which then flows into Port Phillip Bay, and then you're in a bay area, and of course you're in a marine environment, so the salinity levels are higher there. So again, knowing what your creek normally has as a salinity is really important to know whether there's a problem or not. So the salinity is the amount of dissolved salts or ions in the water, and there's lots of different things that can change the salinity. Salty water conducts electricity more ready than pure water, so we measure it as electrical conductivity units, or microsiemens, and that's that little symbol that you see there. We also use, so that's microsiemens, but there's also millisiemens. So when you're getting into seawater, even groundwater, so I used to work up in the Shepparton region, and we'd monitor groundwater, and sometimes that was actually higher microsiemens, so we're talking 40, 50,000, was actually higher than, say, the Port Phillip Bay, which I think is usually around 20 to 30,000. Depending, all the rainwater that we've been having lately has probably reduced the salinity in the Port Phillip Bay at the moment. But again, depending on the mixing zones and where you're monitoring from, it can really vary. So for a healthy stream, such as, say the Merri Creek, you'd really want under 750 microsiemens. But I find on average, particularly in the lower reaches, we sort of more likely to get around 800 to 1,000. Will you be about the same, Trevor, in your sites?
Yeah, that's because the Merri Creek flows through basalt soil or basalt rocks, and that naturally increases the salinity. So although 750, 800 microsiemens is high according to the state regulations, it's not for the Merri Creek because of the geology. It's fairly natural.
So again, really important to know your creek and what's normal for the particular area where your creek is situated as well, and what you've got in the past there as well. So yes, it can really vary. The variations can result from, as Trevor mentioned, the geology of the area, groundwater seepage. So what you'll find in summer for a lot of creeks, particularly in the natural areas where they don't have a lot of sort of, I guess it might not be the geology affecting them or stormwater, they'll have some spring water or groundwater seeping into the creek. So that's happening all the time. But in summer, you're getting less fresh water coming into the system from the rain. So more of a percentage of the inputs are coming in from groundwater. And if that groundwater is really salty, like the ones I mentioned where I worked in Shepparton, where it's up to 50, 60,000, and that's seeping slowly into the creek and you're not getting the rainwater, obviously the salinity is going to increase. So that's not a cause for concern. That's just the natural system doing what it needs to do. So that phenomena happens more in summer, and when you've got lower inputs from rainwater coming in and feeding in. Unfortunately, in urban environments, it's more likely to be some of these other things. So it can be industrial and agricultural effluent, particularly if you've had a sewerage leak. Obviously, most of our creeks in the Greater Melbourne region are sewered, most of them, not all of them. But if there's a leak, well, first of all, you're probably going to smell it anyway, way before you're going to test the salinity, but the salt levels will go up as well. It could an agricultural effluent as well, obviously, from stocking, and if the waste products of the animals are actually hosed out and they end up into the creek. Stormwater runoff as well. We've talked about stormwater runoff, so that depending on what's in that stormwater runoff, that could actually also increase the salinity. When you're clearing land and you're removing the vegetation, and you're getting down to the bare earth again, and then we have rain, and that's causing erosion. That soil coming into the creek contains a lot of ions in that soil. So a lot of the dissolved salts or ions are bound into soil particles. So not only will your turbidity increase if you remove the vegetation, your salt levels will increase as well because they're bound into the soil particles. And evaporation. So that's sort of linked also to summer months when you're having less inflows of rainwater, you're having evaporation from the sun as well, so there's less water in the creek, so the salt's going to become more concentrated because there's not that dilution factor. So sometimes I find when we do water quality testing, water testing in the Merri Creek, after rain, if there's not a lot of stormwater pollution coming in, the salinity levels can drop quite significantly. We can get down to, say, 600 or something.
Well,
so
even lower than that. We often get it down to 200-300 units.
Oh, wow. That's excellent.
Then, if we go out and test after some reasonable rain, but then, say, in late autumn, if it hasn't rained for a while, the readings can be up to 1,000, even 1,200 units. So there's enormous variations in the salinity.
Yep. Yeah, it's a really fascinating one to do. A really easy one to do as well. We use salinity meters that basically have like a multi-probe. So they pick up the slight electrical charge, which is why we call the salinity test electrical conductivity. You're actually basically salty water conducts electricity more readily than pure water, so you're picking up that slight electrical charge to do the measurement. And they're very easy to use. The instructions are in the training manual as well. We do also calibrate these as well to make sure that they're reading accurately each day that you use them. And on to nutrients, Trevor.
Okay, do you want me to do that?
Yes.
Okay, nutrients. There's two main nutrients that we get in waterway.
Sorry, Trevor.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Stephen, you got your hand up. Sorry, I missed you there.
Yeah, I have. I just had a question about the when the creek comes down and it sort of is full of these suspended dispersive soil particles, as to how that affects the electrical conductivity. I believe those are sodic soils, so one would imagine the creek would be full of sodium, but does it actually increase the electrical conductivity, or does dilution account for a lot of that, and it remains fairly constant?
I think the dilution factor would change the salinity, bringing it down a fair bit. I was actually just out with a school group yesterday, and we did salinity, and the creek was 650 microsiemens. So that's a little bit lower, fractionally lower than we normally get. So I would say the dilution factor is, as far as affecting salinity, was greater than the extra salts being washed in by the soils in that case.
So in the creek is milky, we shouldn't necessarily expect any increase in EC?
No, not, but massive increase in the turbidity. It's just huge increase in the turbidity. But yeah, the dilution factor from the rain, I think, would have marginally higher effect on it than the actual addition of the salts.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. I will mention too, when you do get higher turbidity in a creek, like whether it's sodic soils or other types of soils that make the creek more turbid, a lot of our equipment in Waterwatch finds it really difficult to actually do the test. So especially nutrients, as we're had to talk about, we use a colour comparator where you're looking at colours to distinguish the colour. If the bluer for phosphate, for example, the bluer the chemical reaction makes the sample, the more phosphates in it. But things like turbidity can actually impact the how accurate that is. So having a high turbidity makes some of the other parameters a bit difficult to test, depending on your equipment. So that's another issue as well.
All right. So we'll just go back on the nutrients, because the point you just made, I'll bring up. The two main nutrients in waterways are phosphorus and nitrogen. Phosphorus is usually in the form of phosphate, which is how plants can take it off. Nitrogen is usually in the form of nitrate, for allowing plants to take it up. Both of these are heavily affected by human influences. We add fertiliser to land, which washes off into our creeks. We get sewage getting in, which is high nutrient loads. There's a lot of high nutrient loads in industrial waste. Things like detergents, in the past have always included a lot of phosphorus, although hopefully that's being reduced these days. There's a lot of detergents now that are phosphate free, but there's still quite a few that add phosphorus to it. So we're putting in lots and lots and lots of nutrients that are getting into our waterways. And this is one of the really big ones that we see with Waterwatch. Now, phosphorus in the form of phosphate, in freshwater systems, that's naturally a limiting factor, particularly in Australia, because our soils are so poor in phosphorus. It's always been a limiting factor, and it's been a nutrient that's in low levels naturally in our waterways. But with developments gone on over the last 200 years, there's huge amounts more phosphorus. I remember when I was a kid, the big thing that we used to hear about was we found superphosphate in Nauru, which is basically bird poo. And we brought it all over and we started putting it on our soils, and we could grow lots of wheat. Wonderful, wonderful thing, except that it also then gets into all our streams and that. And if it helps wheat grow, it also helps algae and everything else grow. So we're adding all this extra phosphorus into the system from a whole lot of different sources. And that's the one factor that when we do Waterwatch, when we go out every month, that's almost invariably the one that's always above the acceptable limits. Limits set by the SEP guidelines, the State Environmental Protection Plan guidelines. I think from memory says that phosphorus levels should be below 0.02 milligrams per litre. And normally in the Merry Creek, it's normally about 0.07 to 0.1. Sometimes if it's been raining a fair bit and we've had a lot of fresh water come in, it might get down, but it rarely gets down to the 0.02 level. So phosphorus is one that we've had a huge influence on. And the other thing is we measured phosphorus yesterday, and although the salinity might not have gone on, the phosphate levels in the creek were higher with all that extra soil that got washed in. And from memory, the readings yesterday were I think it was 0.15.
Yeah, that's quite high.
Very high. The other interesting thing is you were mentioning it causes problems with the testing. When you do the phosphate test, you're getting a water sample, you're adding some chemicals to create a blue colour, but you also have a control sample, so a source of the water that hasn't had the chemicals added to. And all that extra sediment in the water, when you're looking through and trying to compare the colours, that creates a lot of problems. So the extra turbidity can really be a problem, particularly with the phosphate test, because the blue colour that's created is fairly faint. And if you've got a lot of muck in the water, it's really hard to pick it up. So that's one in particular that causes a lot of problems with the testing if we've got to get a lot of turbidity in the water. But yeah, phosphate is a big problem in all our waterways. And it's just because it's... So I'm just getting rid of a cat.
Your cat. While Trevor's struggling with his cat, I'll just mention as well, I think another big issue that happens, Edwards Lake is one place I'm thinking, and I'm sure there's other wetlands and ponds that it happens around Melbourne as well that you're familiar with. People feeding the birds, feeding ducks, for example. Obviously, the obvious thing is that you shouldn't be feeding ducks because then they rely on that food, and it's the wrong type of food usually for their diets, like white bread and things. But the other thing, of course, is that it causes a lot of ducks and other geese and other animals to be, the waterfowl to be in that area, and then they're adding their own phosphate, their poo, into those areas. So you'll see phosphate levels go really quite high in these areas. And of course, a lot of the time, because they're a wetland or a lake, the water's not moved. There's not a lot of oxygen being added as well. And if it's a hot summer day as well, you're going to get hot temperatures in the water, you're going to have high phosphate, you're going to have low oxygen, and that can form things such as blue-green algae and botulism. And botulism is a bacteria that can actually kill a lot of animals, so especially waterfowl. So, and unfortunately, a lot of the signs of that usually is seeing dead birds floating in the water. And then, of course, it can be a little bit toxic to humans as well, so they need to then close off the area. So I notice up in South Morang or Mill Park, Peter Hopper Lake in Mill Park I'm not sure if it's opened yet. I don't know if anyone who lives around there knows and can tell me, but that was closed off for a number of months earlier this year and late last year because of botulism in those areas. So the recreational value is then gone as well. They've had to fence off the whole area. Not only is it dangerous ecologically and for the animals, for human health is also a concern as well.
Actually, botulism is very dangerous. But you only get botulism or Clostridium botulinum in anoxic waters or in anoxic sediments in the bottom of the stream. So you've got to get the oxygen out of the water first, and that's when botulism can thrive. Actually, one of the biggest sources of botulism for killing people is tinned food. If you don't sterilise your tinned food properly, it's a sealed can, there's no oxygen can get in, and that's when botulism can, or the bacteria that causes it can thrive in it and kill people. So it's actually a very, very dangerous bacteria to have in the water. So we don't really want that. And we'll go on to nitrogen.
Yep.
Right. Nitrogen is another important nutrient. It's the second one after phosphorus. Normally, plants take up nitrogen as nitrate, and so that would be a really good one to measure to get our nitrogen. Unfortunately, measuring nitrate in water isn't a simple test. It's not one that we can just go out and do in the field with community groups. You have to bring it back, a sample back to a lab to do a proper nitrate or nitrite test. So as an alternative to that, we test for ammonia, which isn't the main form of nutrient in the water, but it's one that we can do a simple test for. And the other advantage of doing testing for ammonia is that it does tend to be an indicator of recent sewage pollution in the water. Ammonia doesn't last very long in the water. It usually breaks down fairly quickly to nitrate or nitrite. So it is, if you pick up ammonia in the water, it is usually an indicator of a recent source. And in urban areas, that can often be sewage release. So that's, as I say, it would be better to do nitrate, but we can't, so we just measure ammonia instead. Do you want to add anything to that?
We just had a good question from Louisa on the chat, actually. Is there any articles on the link between feeding ducks bread and the effects of on the effects of the environment? Off the top of my head, I don't know, but I'm wondering, I know I have been sent, there's been a couple of water quality reports done on the Edwards Lake, so I'll have a bit of, I've only skimmed them, I'll have a closer look and see if they've actually covered that particular issue. Or at Peter Hopper Lake. So I will, when I send an email out to everybody, Louisa, I'll see if I can find any information on that. But offhand, I'm sure there must be, but I just don't know. But if anyone else does, please add them in the chat.
Birds Victoria or Birds Australia might have something on that. Because I mean, the recommendation is not to feed bread to birds because it's just not good for them. And also in a place like Edwards Lake, as you say, because there's so many people feeding them, you get a lot more birds than would naturally be there.
Yeah,
that's when you get all the extra phosphate in the water.
And that's the thing, like, yeah, we're all talking about that it's terrible, but Louisa's right, it would be really great to see the evidence to that. And Louisa's just added in there that, yeah, I've heard this too. So many local mums often ask on forums, where can I feed ducks? And I've been invited to do duck feeding with family and friends, and I've had to say, actually, you shouldn't do that. And I try and do it in a nice way, not to shame them. And I have told people not to feed ducks at the lakes, but people don't really like it. So be careful when you tell people that. So I think you're right, Louisa, gently educating them on the impacts is a really good idea. So I will have a look to see if I can find anything, because I think it is a really important thing to talk to people about that impact. I must say there was an interesting, on feeding birds, on that subject, there was a really interesting study done a couple of years ago at a New South Wales university, and it was actually publicised quite a lot. There was a lot on ABC Radio and a few other sources that talked about this. So there'd been a lot of people asking, oh, is it a good idea to feed birds bird seed? You know, from like a lot of people have bird feeders in their backyard and things like that. And the study actually found that if it was just small amounts, so it's like a snack for the bird, I suppose, it's actually not a major problem, which I was quite surprised. I thought it'd be the opposite.